Jesus is more important than taking care of the poor. Now, this is
Hmm.
meant to distinguish between like what used to be called the social gospel, which is now called social justice, which I think is a complete perversion of the term. One friend of mine once noticed if you add an adjective to the word justice, you corrupt it. And that's
Hmm.
why it's interesting when you look in the gospels for all of the talk that many folks make about the responsibility of taking of social justice in Jesus. It turns out he said almost nothing about it.
All right, well, I'm very excited to have my next guest. He is the founder of Stand to Reason. The website is str.org. He is the author of Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, and the story of reality, how the world began, how it ends, and everything important that happens in between. Greg Koukl, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Well, Stelman, I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I guess a great place to start. I just finished reading this yesterday. Thought it was an
Yeah,
excellent book, and I have a
thank you.
bunch of notes on it. Um, I guess just to start from a real broad perspective, what is it about, the story of reality?
Well, what I tried to do, I'm just thinking about the best way to explain it. Probably 15 years ago, maybe even longer now, I wanted to try to put together a teaching that would capture the essentials of Christianity, the core pieces of the Christian worldview, such that if you left any of those particular pieces out, you wouldn't have Christianity anymore. You'd have something else. And I realized, well, that starts with God. I mean, if a lot of people start with Jesus and certain particular things about Jesus, but if there's no God, then it's all irrelevant. That's really the foundation of the whole Christian worldview. And then there's something about human beings that's important because God made human beings to be in friendship with Him. But then people got themselves in a heap of trouble. And so God initiated a rescue plan. And what's significant about the Christian story, Stillman, is that in every other religious account of reality, that's what I'm using the word story to describe, the narrative of what reality is actually like. Um, Human beings rescue themselves. They figure out what the problem is and then they do things to rescue themselves. In this story, human beings don't rescue themselves because they can't. God has to rescue human beings. And so he initiates a rescue plan by becoming a man himself in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And then there are the way he lives his life, Jesus, and the way he ends his life are the two things combined that make it possible for us to be rescued and be restored into that friendship that God always intended for us. And then the decision that any person makes about that event, that exchange, that rescue, if you will determine what happens to them at the very end, which I call the final resurrection. And one of two things is going to happen there, either perfect justice, which is punishment for everything an individual person has ever done wrong and God misses nothing, or forgiveness for everything that anyone has ever done wrong and God misses nothing there. And that would be perfect mercy. So basically, there are five elements to the story, and they're the plot line of the story, so to speak, but they are also the main elements, the main details that have to be in place. They are the most important things that happen in the order they took place. Excuse me. And the words God, man, Jesus, cross, resurrection identify those main things that I just described in summary in 2 minutes or so. There's so much substance to all of that, and I offer in the book also some reasons why people ought to take those particular points seriously, why I think they're actually true,
Yeah.
and they're not just our Christian belief system. I think these represent, as the title of the book says, the story of reality. This is the way the world actually is. And also the subtitle that you read, How the World Began, How It Ends, and everything important that happens in between.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you did a great job in the beginning of kind of laying out different worldviews. You had listed Godism, which we would typically call theism, matterism, which would be there are many forms of naturalism, kind of going
Right,
with atheism, and then there's mindism, which would be kind of pantheism.
right,
And the way I
exactly.
like that you did it is, a lot of atheists today, they kind of redefine atheism as a lack of belief.
Right,
And kind of the assumption is that the default position or the default worldview would be some kind of naturalism. And
right.
I don't think that's true. And I think one thing you appeal to in the book, you can talk, especially in the broken aspect, was, even the way we perceive reality and act in it kind of has a religious substrate to it. We act in a moral way, and we have a sense that there's a way things should be, which is,
Yeah,
is really incompatible
yeah,
with naturalism. And I think you
that's
made a
right.
good case that the very argument we would have against God, which is evil, really is a sense we have that God should come in and save us because
Sure.
things are broken in a way that we just intuitively know.
Yeah, I think there's a twist here, Stelman, that a lot of people don't think about. They think that the um, presence of evil in the world is one of the best evidences against God, when it turns out the presence of evil in the world is a evidence for God, because for there to be evil, that means there have to be things that aren't the way they're supposed to be. And to put it simply, you can't have a way that they aren't supposed to be unless you have a way that they are supposed to be, and you can't have a way they are supposed to be without a sposer.
Right.
And so that was a very, very snappy way of kind of making the moral argument for the existence of God. And I like the way you characterized this too, that a lot of atheists think, well, if there is no God and they have a reason why they think there might not be a God, that just delivers them into kind of a neutral, naturalistic position, and everything seems to fall together nicely for them. Yeah, well, it's just me and the world and nature, and everything's fine. Okay. But the fact is, when people begin to talk about their world, they realize that there's a whole bunch of stuff that they talk about, like the problem of evil, for example, or human rights, or think of all the values that humanists, secular humanists, hold to be important, and they are characteristically atheistic. Well, none of these values make any sense at all in a naturalistic, physicalistic, materialistic universe. And so, therefore, their story doesn't turn out to fit the world the way it actually is. And the fitting the world the way it actually is the classical definition of truth. If your view fits the way the world is, then it's true. And if it doesn't fit the way the world is, then it's not true, at least on those points that don't fit. And so
Hmm.
these become, by taking a stepping back a little bit, and taking a look at the way the world is. Forget about religion or holy books or anything, right? Let's reflect on reality. And
Yeah.
then what characterization makes sense of all the important pieces? And that's the job that needs to be done. And of course, I attempt that in the story of reality, and make the case that the Christian view of reality covers the bases best.
Yeah, no, that definitely. One point in there that I really liked, and that's kind of going along the same lines of something is broken within us. You started talking about people are not basically good, and you were talking about a worldview that maybe it's lack of education or poverty or corrupt social systems that have caused people to behave poorly. And I heard a lot of this in college. They would
Yeah,
make arguments that it
sure.
was corrupt social institutions, and I always asked, well, doesn't that beg the questions who created the institutions?
Hmm.
Right? And if the institutions are corrupt, well, we created them. So shouldn't that mean there's something corrupt about us?
Yeah,
And it's
it's a
been
good
the
question.
norm. The historical norm has been societies that are corrupt and murderous, like the communist societies and the Nazi societies. And it wasn't really until the West or Western culture was founded on a Judeo-Christian ethic that we could even make the argument now that people are basically good. Well,
Hmm.
yeah, but we've been born in a society and our thinking has been so saturated from the time we were born with these morals. Not all societies valued forgiveness. Not
Right,
all
right.
societies valued truth. The majority of them certainly didn't until Western culture. And I just wanted
Or,
to,
or, or even caring for other human beings. I mean, it's a
absolutely.
foundational instinct that we have as Americans. This is not something that human beings have, generally speaking.
Yeah, and I just wanted to read two quick quotes to you. and get your thoughts on them. So one is Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. He
Right.
wrote, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts."
Right.
And Jordan Peterson had a quote I thought was really good, kind of talk about the problem of evil. And he said, "I think we should be very careful at laying the existence of evil at the feet of the creator without looking to our own role in producing it."
Right. Well, I'm inclined to give the nod to both, because I think
Well,
it's
no,
not just
they
because
weren't
they.
meant to disagree.
No, right. No, I think they're profound because they a lot of profound insights, reflections are profound precisely because they resonate with our deepest intuitions about the way the world actually is. There's a
Mhm.
kind of a common sensibility to them. And so Solzhenitsyn looks at the world, and he, having lived in the Gulag, and he knows the results of when an atheistic worldview runs society, then it is the powerful that get their way, and the dissidents like Solzhenitsyn, then they get punished in virtue of their dissidence, not because they did something bad, because in that world system there is no deep good and bad in a moral sense, but because they fought the system, and they were the weaker ones, and the powerful ones went out. And so his observation then was, and it's a human observation, that the problem is not with the systems, it's, as you pointed out earlier, Stelman, it's with the people who established the systems. Okay. And excuse me, that is an observation that anyone can make, and many have, by the way. What worldview makes sense of that? Well, the Christian worldview makes sense of it.
Mhm.
And here's a distinction. We're talking a little bit about human beings being basically bad, but let's refine that a little bit more. According to the Christian worldview, human beings are made out of good stuff. All right.
Mhm.
So they're, in a certain sense, ontologically, if I could use that term, in terms of their substance, their existence, the stuff they're made of, so to speak, their being, they are good because they're made in God's image. Now, by the way, this goodness we all know. So this,
Yeah.
I'm trading on a human intuition here. We This is why we gas termites, but we don't gas Jews. And we know that's wrong if our moral compass, pardon me, is not broken. This is why we have human rights. This is why we have moral obligations to other human beings that are not sustained towards non-human creatures. Okay, some people are a
Mhm.
little confused on that nowadays, but most people get that straight. Okay, well, that's just an observation about reality. Why is it like that? Well, certainly naturalistic evolution makes no sense of that whatsoever. But the Christian worldview, stating that human beings were made in the image of God, that there is something God-like about them, makes sense of all of those particulars. We're made of good stuff, but there's something else, right? That we're terribly broken. The movie Schindler's List, that came out a number of years ago, maybe before your time, I don't know, but it was the best picture, and Steven Spielberg did it. And it was about a man named Oscar Schindler, who was really a self-seeking German person, hiring inmates from concentration camps, Jewish inmates, for his own benefit in his factories. And then he realized that if he did this more effectively, he'd be able to save their lives. So you have a man who's deeply broken, yet at the same time, he's does this incredibly noble thing, and then saves the lives of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Jews that would otherwise have perished. So here you got an interesting a cameo. You got a picture that this good and the bad that Solzhenitsyn was talking about is in not just mankind in general, but it's in each individual person. And we know that.
Mhm.
Well, what worldview makes sense of that? The Christian worldview does. We're made in the image of God, so we're beautiful, but we also have rebelled against God, and therefore, not only are we broken, but we broke the whole world in the process, which is why we live in a broken world. Okay,
Mhm.
and Jordan Peterson's statement goes right along with that. People want to blame God. Oh, there's evil in the world. Oh, how could there be a God if there's evil in the world? And my response is, how can there not be a God if there's evil in the world. This is the
Mm,
moral argument that I develop a little bit in the book, The Story of Reality, but it's not my argument. It's been around for a long time, and it's a
yeah.
straightforward, common sense article. Our argument. I won't go into the argument proper right now, although I made reference to it a few moments ago. But the point is people are complaining about God. Why did God allow this and that to happen? 9/11, whatever, any awful thing. And my response is, it's the same reason that he allows you or me to do the same evil we do every single day. We want to do it. We want God to interfere with other people's evil. We do not want God to interfere with our evil.
Hmm.
And that's, and by the way, it sounds to me, Stelman, like you've been around the block enough times just in your own study, that many atheists have made this very clear. Here's why I'm an atheist. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want God telling me what to do. I don't want him especially interfering with my sex life. I mean, they say this. So you can see this dynamic working, and all of it is a further affirmation to me that the Christian worldview fits the way the world actually is. So once again, we are made out of good stuff, but we are also moral. So we're ontologically good, but we are morally broken. And both of those facts, central to the Christian worldview, help us to understand something very important about the world that I think other worldviews do not explain well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I know I said people aren't basically good. I also wouldn't say they are basically bad. I think we're capable of great good and we're capable of great evil, and our proclivity is it's much easier to behave immorally and behave
Right,
evilly. And of course, in the Christian worldview, that makes perfect sense because we have this fallen nature, because
right.
Adam and Eve sinned, and now we just inherit a corrupt nature.
Yeah, you don't have to teach kids to be bad.
Absolutely, I know. Yeah,
There's a great book. It's a classic, actually, Golding's Lord of the Flies. For those people who have, I don't know if you've read it or not, but
I
for
know.
those people who want to talk about the basic goodness of mankind, this story is really addressing that question. And it's about a bunch of young boys that get stranded on an island somewhere, and they're like 20 or 30 of them, and they have to fend for themselves until and if they get rescued. And what ends up happening is their darker angels of their nature take over, and you see
Mm,
how everything begins to spiral downward as this dark side of humankind begins to rule.
mm. Yeah, that's a great point.
Lord
Um,
of Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. I'm gonna have to look that up and put that on my reading list.
Yeah.
Um, there was a point in here that kind of go off on a little bit of a rabbit trail
It's
that you
okay.
made, and it resonated with me because I was having a conversation about this with a friend of mine not too long ago. You were talking about what Jesus meant by the poor when he referenced them in the Old Testament, and
Oh
that it
yeah.
wasn't simply a lack of money. Because me and my friend we were having a discussion about, well, is there a point, say it's like pastors, when they make so much money that it becomes immoral? And my basic argument was there isn't any nobility in poverty, right? I think if you can do well for yourself, that's fine. And you talked about in the book how simply being in poverty doesn't cause people to act badly. And one thing I've gotten from Steven Crowder is that money amplifies character. So if you're a generous person, you're going to be generous with the little you have, or if you have a lot.
That's
And
right.
somebody who's greedy, even if they're poor, they're still going to be greedy, whether they have a little bit of money or a
Right.
lot of money.
Right. No, that's a great observation. Jesus said it like this. It isn't what actually used two different ways of characterizing. He said, "From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So it's what's inside that comes out, for example, in the mouth. And I'm just making a parallel to what you do with your funds. If you're greedy and poor, you're still going to be greedy. If you're
Mhm.
greedy and rich, you're going to be greedy. But if you're generous and poor, you're going to be generous with what little you have. And if you're rich and you're generous, you're going to do that. So it's the inside that describes it. And Jesus also, food in this particular case, now the Jews were really strict about the foods they ate, but what came out of them was vice, not
Mhm.
virtue. And it's not the foods that go into you that matter, Jesus, but rather the virtues that come out of you, hopefully, instead of the vices that make the biggest difference. So what you just described is really Jesus' point of view in general.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus in the book of John said, the poor you always have with you. But and his point was not to denigrate the poor, but there was expensive oil that was used to anoint his feet, that the disciples, actually it was Judas, who the text said was pilfering from the money box, who said we could have sold that and put the money in and given it to the poor. And he's thinking he can steal it, basically.
Right.
But Jesus said, this was done to honor me before my death. And that's more important than the poor. And so he's putting things in perspective. The poor, let's see, we have a responsibility to the poor. I mean, this is clear throughout the scriptures, in the Old Testament, the Gospels. But what ends up happening is social justice becomes a Marxist approach to looking at the economy. The poor are poor because they've been abused and because the wealth has been taken from them by other people. And that's a different discussion, but I'm just saying that phrase is informed by a different worldview that I don't think is sound, okay? When there's injustice, it ought to be taken care of. But being poor is not an injustice in itself. And it is not necessarily an evidence of injustice that's been done. And that's why it's interesting when you look in the Gospels, for all of the talk that many folks make about the responsibility of social justice in Jesus. It turns out he said almost nothing about it. Now, if people disagree with this, all they have to do is read the Gospels. I started in the Gospel of John. I found not a single reference in the entire Gospel of John, which was the final gospel, the greatest characterization of the person and the work of Christ ever written, not a single reference to anything that could be marginally construed as social justice or caring for the poor. The lone reference to the poor was this dismissal that I mentioned to you a moment ago. And now you're going to find some more in others. There were 4 or 5 major discourses of Jesus: the Sermon on the Mount, the Bread of Life discourse, the Upper Room discourse, and the Olivet discourse. And those 4 major discourses, the 3 of them, no mention of anything that pertained to social justice. The only one that sounded a little bit like it might be the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus didn't say, blessed are the poor. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, those who acknowledge their spiritual poverty. There are people, and Jesus ran into lots of them, who were not poor, but they were poor in spirit. Okay? And then Nicodemus, for example, Joseph of Arimathea, they had wealth, they had standing, but they came to Christ with humility. Now, they kind of stayed on the fringe a little bit because there was pressure from their friends not to be too public about it. But in any event, Joseph of Arimathea was the one who took Jesus' body and put it in his own tomb. Okay, so those people were rich but poor in spirit. Then you have other people who are they're poor, but they're not poor in spirit. In other words, they may not have very much money, but they still think that on their own they can satisfy the needs and demands of God. Jesus' concern was not with wealth. Jesus' concern was with our spiritual condition. He didn't just welcome the marginalized and put off the wealthy. He welcomed repentant people regardless of their status. And he put off those who were not repentant. He condemned those who wouldn't come to him, poor or rich. Now, we don't have a lot of examples of the poor who, I'm trying to think right now, but they don't stand out, of poor who did not come to him, because generally it was the poor who were the poor in spirit too. They were the downtrodden, and they knew they needed. And Jesus himself said it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But what's key here is the reason. It had nothing to do with their economic status. It had to do with the status of their heart.
Mm. That's an excellent way of putting it. And I think there's something really brilliant what you just said, because I've always talked about this idea of social justice being inherently a contradiction to actual justice. And I really like the way you said it, adding an adjective to the word justice corrupts it, because justice is blind to race, it's blind to economic status.
Right.
Justice is just doing what's right.
Yeah.
And so you shouldn't need to add
Yeah.
anything to
You
it.
know, in the Hebrew scriptures, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it says explicit. I think it's in the Pentateuch, in the law. It said, "Do not favor the poor in judgment." It's a command
Mm,
in the Mosaic law not to favor the poor in judgment. So, for all the concern that the scripture has for the poor, helping the poor, especially those who are poor because they have been treated unjustly, even so, we have to be careful not to favor them just because they're poor. In the current situation of social justice, that seems to be the point. Because they're poor, they ought to be favored over others that have more money. This is, by the way,
mm.
the notion behind the graduated income tax system, just as an observation. Um,
Right,
but
right.
but I think the impulse that a lot of people have is based on this saying, and I don't know, just tell me if you think this notion sounds familiar. From each according to his ability, from each according to his ability. So the poor have less ability, they have to
Right.
give less. The rich have so much more, so they have to pay their fair share, right? Okay,
Right.
so from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. To each according to their need. The rich don't need it, they got it. The poor need it, so we're going to give them to the need. Okay, so that's a
Mm.
classic kind of, I mean, does this notion that I just expressed sound familiar?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, okay. So, because this is the classic impulse of redistributing wealth we have in our culture. That
Absolutely.
statement, from
Sounds like
each
so.
according to his ability, to each according to his need, is from Karl Marx.
Well, I was gonna say it sounds like socialism. Yeah.
It is. It's Karl Marx.
Yeah.
But you say this now, even in, maybe if you use a little different words, so it doesn't sound so aphoristic and so clever and like, oh, that sounds like somebody wrote that sometime in the past. But you just explained the ideas. People are, especially young people, oh, they're all for it because they're not the ones who have the ability to give and then
Right.
are vulnerable to have it taken from them. They're the ones who think they have the need, and so it's given to them. So you can see why that would be popular with the youth. Has nothing
Mm.
to do with justice.
I mean, well, I'm really glad you brought that up. Steven Crowder's made the point before. We're told that capitalism it fosters greed and it's only for the greedy. When really socialism can only work by appealing to people's innate greed and saying, hey, look, you don't have it. Look how much stuff that guy has. We can
Yeah,
take it from him and just
sure. Yeah,
redistribute it at the
I
bottom.
I agree. Capitalism is not greed. Capitalism is meritocracy. There's a huge difference. In other words, capitalism is grounded on the idea if you work hard to do something and accomplish something, then you get rewarded for it.
Mhm.
There's merit there. You don't get punished for it, you get merit for it. And incidentally, um, putting it as greed is another way of saying that it's based on selfishness, because greed is a vice and
Mhm.
selfishness is a vice. But there's a difference between selfishness and self-interest.
Right.
For me to want to better my set of circumstances for me and my family, that is not selfish. That it is self-interested, but it's not
Mm.
necessarily selfish. And so if I think, well, what if I do something and start something and invent something and build something out? Okay, wow. Then why shouldn't I benefit from it? One of the biggest humanitarian donors in the world is uh, what's his name? The Microsoft guy,
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Okay, he wasn't always like that, by the way.
Right.
Until by the time he got married, then he got a soft heart. But what Bill Gates, even if he had not done any of that, a lot of people on the political left think, "Oh, that's all wonderful," and I think it is good. But Bill Gates improved the condition of billions of people on the planet. He
Yeah.
created millions and millions of jobs. He created all kinds of opportunity, not just jobs working for Microsoft, but their equipment created other people who wanted to be creative to make new things that other people could use. And in the making of those things, they merit being paid for that. It's a
Absolutely.
meritocracy. Okay, that's capitalism. You take all of that away. Listen, I traveled in 6 different communist countries behind the Iron Curtain before the Iron Curtain came down. I sat in a restaurant in Kiev in the Ukraine in 1976, and we couldn't get served. Why? Because there weren't waiters, that there was too many people. There's hardly anybody in the restaurant, and there are a lot of waiters standing around. The reason we didn't get served very well, I mean, it took us a long time to get in, is it did not matter whether we got served or not.
Mm.
They got paid exactly the same whether they sold food or not, at least the waiters and stuff. So it didn't matter. It didn't matter because there was no meritocracy. There was no desire to do something that deserved merit or earned merit. Okay. Everything shuts down. Okay. They don't invent medications to help people because there's no profit
Yeah.
motive. You know, if there's no profit motive, people aren't going to do what they might have to do the things that help people, like in medicines. And there's a whole raft of things like this. So I know the drill. I've seen it plenty of times, and folks who want to push back against that do not understand and call capitalism all greed, whatever, do not understand the way the world works.
No, not at all. And people get mad about Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. It's like, yeah, but you're sitting on your iPhone shopping on Amazon, and everybody's lives are better. They deserve everything they've gotten. And we've been told this lie. Well, at least socialism is more moral than capitalism. And I think even a lot of conservatives kind of fall into the trap of saying, well, socialism is a great idea in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. And it's like, no, it's an immoral idea in theory.
Sure,
You're
of course.
greedy, and you think, oh, Bill Gates has all that money, I'm just going to take it instead of working hard to earn it.
Right.
No, that's an immoral idea.
Right. This is my question at this point, Stelman, is when somebody says it's immoral and socialism is more moral, I'm going to ask them, how? Explain it to me. Okay, young college student there with a college loan, or parents that are paying your education because they're not paying it themselves. I guarantee you, they can't afford it. I worked myself through college, and I got 2 master's degree, and my folks didn't pay a dime. They didn't even sign off on a loan. Okay, that was long. Things have changed since then, but so it's harder now. I understand that, but somebody else who's benefiting a student from can say these kinds of things. How is it more moral? Can I reach into that person's pocket and take the money out of that person's pocket and give it away to someone I think it's better to give to? Because that person, I don't care who it is you're talking to, is rich compared to the most of the people in the world. So can I just say, hey, you're rich, you don't need this? Are you kidding? You don't need this. Really? No, you don't need this. According to my assessment, I'm going to give it to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
It's better. Well, that's not going to work well with that individual. They're going to consider that a kind of theft. All of a sudden now, socialistic principles are immoral when applied to that person in their circumstance.
Yeah, that's a great point. Steven Crowder's made the point. He's saying, suppose I had $10 in my pocket, right? I'm going to spend it on drugs. And you think, well, that money would be better spent donating to a charity. You still don't have the right to beat me up and take that $10 out of my pocket. And contrast that with capitalism. It's not built on greed, but the brilliance of capitalism is even if you are driven by nothing but greed, you can't get that money without voluntarily trading with other people or creating something that's a social benefit.
That's so important. If I'm driven completely by greed, I mean, you could say in one sense, and you and I both disagreed that that's necessarily the case with people. They're trying to better themselves. That's what America is all about, the American dream and all that. But what if we were just good? Who are these other people to pass judgment on my character, for goodness sake?
Right.
All right? Because even if I'm motivated by greed, as you're pointing out, the notion of the exchange of goods and services is based in almost every single case on complete liberty. We each have the liberty to go where we want and spend what we want on the things that are offered to us. And you know what? If they're too expensive, the price is going to have to come down. If it's too expensive for the rank and file, the price is going to have to come down. That's the nature of the market. And if I don't want to freely give my money for that product, then that product is not they don't take that money away from me to give me the product that they think I should have. Okay.
Yeah.
So capitalism is based on freedom. Look, right now in our community, I live in Thousand Oaks in Southern California. Right down the road, there's a Home Depot, and right across the street, they're building a Lowe's. Well, Lowe's is like the other big box store that competes with Home Depot, right? One is orange, the other one's blue. Okay. What do I think about that as a consumer? I'm thrilled.
Yeah.
Because these people across the street from each other now have to compete for my business.
Absolutely.
That means they're going to be falling all over themselves to lower their prices and make better deals and give better service to keep me in their store rather than somebody else's store. Okay. Why? So that they can make the money. Oh, that's greedy. That may be greedy in terms of their motives, if you want to characterize it that way, but who benefits? I benefit. I'm the consumer. I get something better. You put the government in control of that stuff, forget about it. The government can't do anything right. Everything the government does, it does poorly. Some things only the government can do. Manage our borders, fight our wars, okay? And even them, they do it poorly.
Yeah.
All right? But, that's what they have to do. Why would we want to put them in charge of everything? Because then everything will be, look, think of this. DMV. I have here. See this thing?
Yes.
I have to get my driver's license renewed. I can't do it by mail because it's been 10 years. I got to go in. With fear and trembling, I look at that letter because it's DMV. Who wants to go in the DMV? It's all run by the local government. It's a pain. Okay. Do you want your life to be DMV? Do you want your medical care all to be done like the DMV? Do you want? No, I've been there. 6 communist countries. I know what it's like. It does not work. And it's never worked anywhere. It's been tried anywhere in the world for the last 100 years, actually 103 years. Yeah. It was the Russian Revolution, 1916, or maybe it was 1917, 102 years. It hasn't worked, okay, for obvious reasons. You don't have to have a PhD in econ. Anyway, we've kind of gotten off into another thing here a little bit.
Well, it's funny you say that. Because not only does it not work, it tends to be extremely murderous. If you want to evaluate it on more moral grounds.
That's right. That's true.
And yeah, like you were saying, like before UPS and FedEx, like the postal office, they didn't have 2-day shipping, 1-day shipping. It got there when it got there. You hoped.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. But incidentally, because the UPS and those other private things have really worked hard to do the job, the U.S. Postal Service has gotten a lot better. I don't know if you noticed this, but I have over the last 20 years.
Because they have competition.
Because they have some competition, real competition. Now, the other guys can't do letters, but if they could, boy, it'd be all over with for the U.S. Postal Service. You know what I'm saying? It's just the law restricts that level of competition. So, by the way, you mentioned about these regimes, communist regime, socialist regime being murderous. People offer the canard against religion in general, including Christianity, that religion is called more worship and war and bloodshed, etc., and murder than anything else in history. This is completely false.
Yeah.
No one holds a candle to the millions and millions and millions, over 100 million, that have been killed just at the hands of 3 people. And Hitler is not one of them, just for the record, as bad as I'm talking about Lenin and Stalin and Mao. Atheists all, materialists all, socialist communists all. And by the way, I'm just not guilt by association. There is a connection, a logical connection.
Absolutely.
In the viewpoints and the worldviews and the procedures they carried out. Now, I want to be careful to say that not all atheists do this.
Of course.
However, atheists are allowed to morally. That's the key. Now,
Mhm.
somebody's going to take exception to that. And so I have a question. Name me one moral principle that is inherent to atheism that disqualifies genocide. Now, they can't do that because there are no moral principles inherent to atheism. And therefore, even though there are groups of atheists that call themselves humanists to say we're living by a different code, they have no grounds by which they can object to someone like a Mao or a Lenin or a Stalin
Mhm.
doing what they did by their own subjectivistic code, which is grounded in power, because without God, that's all that we have left to get what we want done. All right.
Yeah,
So another,
that's a great point. Um, so we go back to my notes. I guess to bring it full circle, we got to get to Jesus. And one thing I thought was really great that you did in the book, because it's very in a narrative form, and someone can get caught up in that. But one point you make is, look, the story about Jesus, if it's not actually true, it's no good to us. And even
that's
the New
right.
Testament says we're to be pitied if we believe this, but it's just a fairy tale, and he didn't really
That's
rise from the dead.
exactly right. Yeah, that's thank you for making that point, because there are a lot of challenges nowadays on that you hear on the internet and from atheists, etc., not from scholars, because scholars don't believe this.
Right, right.
But the challenge is that Jesus never existed, and that the whole tale about Jesus is just recycled mythology from the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies of Isis and Osiris, and a whole host Mithras and a whole bunch of these pagan divines that never existed, and Jesus is just a repeat of that. And this I spoke at to a very large audience at Purdue University a number of years ago, and somebody raised that as an objection, an atheist. And I said, and I wasn't trying to be funny, but I was just saying, as a matter of fact, I said, you've been spending too much time on the internet. And everybody started laughing when I said that. I wasn't trying to deride him, but these are popular tales that circulate um, on the internet. And when I say circulate, I'm using my words advisedly. They go round and round and round and round, because there is no source for them in academia. All
Right.
right. When you go back to the primary source historical documents regarding these fables, you find out that there is none of these things that are characterized in these lists, that Osiris and Jesus, they look like they're the same. None of these things are actually in the original accounts of these mythologies. Virtually none. And the only ones that look similar are ones that actually show up after the time of Jesus. So it looks like they're the ones copying from Jesus and not the other way around. Plus, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because
Mhm.
if we have reliable historical sources on the life of Jesus itself, then it doesn't matter if certain aspects of his life sound like fictitious accounts of the past. It's irrelevant. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if there's a matchup. There's all kinds of historical matchups that are like that, where you have something happens fictitiously, and then a real event very much like it happens. Famously, in 1889, there was a book written by, I have it right over here, somewhere in my pile of books. It's called Futility, written by a guy named Robertson. And it was about a transatlantic voyage, a maiden transatlantic voyage of the largest ocean liner um, ever built, an indestructible ocean liner with triple screws, making a trip between England and New York City, London and New York. And in the middle of the night in March, it hit an iceberg and it sunk. And by the way, and because there wasn't enough lifeboats to provide for everybody, more than half of the people on the ship drowned. Okay, that's 1889. The book was called Futility. Um, what, 12, 14 years later, what, 1912, April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sank and matched
Yep.
all of those things. In fact, in this book in 1889, the name of the ship was the Titan.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. Your friends can check it out right now.
Yeah. It's a
The,
point J. Warner Wallace talks about a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you got it from me. I'm not sure, but yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just so there. No one would look at the New York Times on on April 15th, 1912, and see the wreck of the Titanic and say, "Oh no, that's a bunch of phony stuff," because I read the book Futility, which
Hmm.
incidentally was later released under a different title called The Wreck of the Titan,
Mm.
just to trade off of what took place in reality. So if people want to find it, they can find it under the title The Wreck of the Titan. Anyway, the point I'm making is just because a fictitious story happened at one point, it doesn't disclose on the possibility that a real life story that has a lot of the same elements could happen at a later point. You just have to make sure that the
Yeah.
historical justification for this later element is good. And in the case of Jesus, it is. It's magnificent.
Hmm.
This is why historians do not buy that. They don't buy any of that stuff. Only internet atheists buy that stuff because it
Right.
sounds good. It sounds good to uneducated ears.
Yeah. Well, yeah, even like you have the case with Mithras, who did live before Jesus,
Right?
but it wasn't till after Jesus, the Roman Mithraic believers started celebrating communion in Mithras's name. And then so you get communion tied with Mithras, and they go, oh, well, look, Mithras had a communion associated with him before Jesus. And it's just bad history all
Right.
around.
Yeah.
One of the points I like that you made in the book is when you were getting into some of the arguments for Jesus, you gave kind of a warning, which is, a lot of people say you can't trust the Gospels because the writers were biased. But another thing you talked about was some people discount the Gospels simply because they have miracles in them, which is itself a bias.
That's
So on
right.
the one
Yeah.
hand, people say, well, we can't trust them; they were biased, but then they think an anti-supernaturalism bias is in order.
Right. And I'm glad you brought this up, Stelman, because there are actually two different kinds of bias that are in view here. The second kind, you can't trust the Bible because it has miracles in it. Miracles don't happen. That is a destructive bias. In other words, somebody has made a decision about the way the world is without justification, by the way. Where,
Hmm.
where is the where is the line of argument that demonstrates that the conclusion there can be no supernatural miracles is a valid conclusion? Where is that line of argument? It does not exist. And it's not right. And it's not being offered. This is just an assumption. And then it creates a bias against anything that suggests they're miracles. No, I'm not saying we should believe every miracle claim. I'm simply saying we can't dismiss it simply because our philosophy that we have arbitrarily chosen forecloses on it before we examine the possibility. That's a destructive a bias or a bias to distort. Now, in the case of the disciples, we have something entirely different. Okay.
Hmm.
Would it be fair to say that the disciples had a point of view about Jesus?
I think so.
Yes. Okay. Could that be characterized as a bias?
Sure.
Sure, I agree with that. That could be considered a bias. But just identifying it as a bias that is a point of view doesn't mean that it is a bias that is distorting of the facts. So let me go back just a moment. If I were, and others have done this, but anyone who wanted to write a history of the Holocaust in Germany from 1939 to 1945, um, probably they would one of the things that they try to do is interview people who had actually participated in the Holocaust, right? This is getting harder to do now because there's not that many are still alive, but I've
Hmm.
met them personally.
Wow.
So in the past, so would they have a point of view about the Holocaust? Yeah. Would that mean that they have a bias? Yeah. Okay. But would anybody deny that they are the absolutely best source of first person information about what took place during the Holocaust? How
Yeah.
could anybody deny
Right.
that? Okay, so this is the situation with the apostles who recorded the Gospels. Yes, they had a point of view, but they had a point of view because they experienced certain things that they are reporting on. Okay, the question is, are they lying? Are they distorting? Well, if they're distorting, who suffers from that? They're the ones who suffer because they put their life on the line for the truthfulness of the things they recorded. It
Yeah.
was dangerous to be a Christian in the first century. They were getting killed by the Jews and by the Gentiles. Okay. So why would somebody who had a point of view about Jesus lie about it in a way that would get them killed? This makes no sense. So the distinction between the biases is an important one to keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and taking that into account, one could argue they actually had a bias to the opposite, right? They had a bias to recant their story if it was false. They had a bias to, you know, just say, yeah, no, we were making this stuff up because hey, they're going to save their own
That's
lives
right.
by doing that.
That's right.
So
Their self-interest was not in writing the Gospels and promoting the gospel.
yeah,
That's a very, very good point.
yeah. So the question wouldn't even be are they biased? The question would be does their bias give them reason to distort the facts? And I think in the case of the New Testament writers, the answer is absolutely no.
Right. Yeah, that is the right question to ask, Stelman. Right.
Um, so we don't have a ton of time left. I did want to get your take because I know this is something you've been outspoken on is the abortion issue. And of course,
Right.
in New York not too long ago, they passed the law legalizing abortion up until the moment of birth. And then you even had Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, saying, yeah, if even if a baby's born, we'll resuscitate it. It can be perfectly healthy sitting in the next room. And then we can have a discussion about whether
What
to
to
kill
do
it or not.
next? Right.
Yes,
Yeah, I
yes.
heard that interview myself, and then Vermont was doing the same. And so you have states that are beefing up their laws and even their constitutions to protect the liberty. I'm not going to call it a right, though technically it is a legal right, but I don't think it's a legitimate right. So I'm just going to call the liberty to have an abortion. Couple of thoughts about this whole thing. First of all, none of these laws actually establish anything new because of the combination of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton going all the way back to 1973. Abortion has been legal up until the last moment of pregnancy. Okay, now um, some some states have restricted that, but but strictly speaking, they were not increasing abortion liberties. What they're trying to do is secure them because of a fear that the changing makeup of the Supreme Court is going to begin to undermine the legitimacy of Roe, and so they're thinking, well, if the Supreme Court throws it back to the states, we want to make sure we have very robust pro-abortion mechanisms in place, whether it's law or constitution, and that's why they're doing this. That's if the Supreme Court throws it back to the states.
Mhm.
But if the Supreme Court rules on abortion, there's only going to be one good reason for them to rule or overturn Roe, and that is because innocent human beings are being destroyed in the womb. In other words, it's going to be de facto homicide inside the womb.
Mhm.
Okay. Why would that be thrown back to the states if the court determines that human beings inside the womb deserve no less protection than the very same human being outside of the womb? The governor there of Virginia came under attack because the implication that he was in favor of infanticide, or he was willing to, shrug at infanticide. Okay. And so people got all up in arms. But why would that cause them to be up in arms? This very baby that might have its neck snipped after it was born is the same baby that is just a few inches away inside of the womb before it's born. It's the same baby. The only difference is moving the location. How could changing the location have any influence on the value of that human baby that we're talking about? Obviously, it has no difference. There is no functional difference there is no moral difference. There's a functional difference. There's no moral difference between infanticide and abortion, particularly late-term abortions. This ought to be obvious. I think there's no difference between all abortions, but ought to be really obvious to anybody, for goodness sake. Late-term abortions and infanticide are the same, exactly morally. If
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
bothered by one, you should be bothered by the other.
Mhm. That's a great point. And even one of the states, I want to say it was New York, but I'm not 100% sure, but it was one of the states actually changed the law. So there was a law that, if you kill a pregnant woman, you're charged with 2 murders there. They actually changed the law so that only the assault on the woman counted. And to be fair, that's perfectly consistent with the abortion laws, especially in New York, but it reveals just the horror of it. It reveals how morally
That's right.
corrupt the whole idea
Yeah.
is.
Well, 2/3 of the states in the union have fetal homicide laws. In other words, they understand that if a woman is killed and she's carrying a baby, then that's 2 dead human beings, not just one, and it's a double homicide. That includes the state of California, by the way. And what it bears testimony to is a huge double standard in the way the unborn is viewed. In California, it's a double homicide unless the one that does the killing is a doctor and the mother says it's okay. So that's legal abortion. And yeah, I know you're screwing up your face like, what difference would that make to the baby? Of course. Of course. See, yep. I just saw the other night, and your viewers may want to check this out, a movie called Gosnell, Gosnell. And I just saw it like 3 nights ago, and I got it off of Netflix, Gosnell. And it's the
Oh, it's on
story about
Netflix now? Good. Yeah, because
Yeah,
I
it
didn't see
is.
that.
Yeah, it's a story of a abortion doctor who was convicted of murder, of infanticide. Abortion, strictly speaking, wasn't on the table on this trial, but he would have gotten a death sentence if he hadn't plea bargained. He ended up now he's in life in prison on 3 counts of murder. But he murdered thousands and thousands and thousands of children, and that were born alive, and he just snipped their necks. But they only get them on 3. So, but just watch the movie, which is not campaigning against abortion. It is all based on the transcripts and all the particular details of this investigation, and you will get a very clear picture of this ugly thing that we're dealing with.
Yeah. One last thing I want to get to on this topic, if somebody just goes on YouTube and just Googles your name, Greg Koukl, what is like either at the top video or one of the top videos, and it's from years ago, you had a caller in on your radio show of a woman, criticizing your stance on abortion.
Oh yeah.
And she was saying, well, do you feel any obligation to these children to take them in after? And I think one of the reasons that video is still so popular, is the way you handled it was brilliantly, but it also shows who really cares in this scenario.
Was it actually a video, or is it just an audio of the conversation?
It has a picture, but it is just an audio.
Oh, I see. Well, in this case, I had just interviewed, as I recall, I remember this conversation, and I just interviewed Scott Klusendorf, who was with Stand to Reason for 8 years and one of the best pro-life debaters in the country, has his own organization called Life Training Institute. And so after I'd interviewed him, then this person calls in and then very innocently sounding starts asking questions. Oh, that was a nice interview. You've made some good points. I was thinking, by the way, are you at all, and here was the gist of it, do you care at all about those women who can't get an abortion and now they're forced to give birth, And so what I ended up, every time she asked me a question, it turned out that I had an answer. I said, well, in my case, I have 2 daughters that we adopted from crisis pregnancy. Oh, well, yeah, but what about those people who don't get adopted? Oh, well, I raise money for crisis pregnancy centers. Every year I do fundraisers to help them raise money. Oh, but what about those who don't? And so, well, my wife is every 2 weeks for years has done a single mom's care group where she helps them and encourages them and all this. It did not matter what I said. It was never enough for this person. And of course, even if I did nothing and no one else did anything for the women who carried to term in unwanted abortions, it doesn't mean it's okay to kill those babies. I mean, that sidesteps the moral question. But it was very clear that this was a pro-choice person who was sandbagging, trying to be nice, asking me these questions, trying to catch me and trying to make me sound like I was unloving. The problem is, it just so happened in my case, I had a bunch of things that I could say that we are doing to help those people, but it still was never enough. And then I pointed out, there's nothing I'm going to be able to say that's going to satisfy you. But by the way, none of those things are relevant to the question of whether it's okay to kill unborn children.
Yeah.
Because they're helpless and in the way, and that kind of thing. So it's interesting that stands out in your mind. It was a very, very good call.
Well, because for me, it highlights like who really cares. We're told, well, we just don't care about women because look at the multiple hard situations they can be in. And crisis pregnancy centers, they help with adoption services. They help with getting mothers on food stamps. They help with nannying services. They help with all these kinds of things that Planned Parenthood doesn't even come close to doing. Planned Parenthood gets paid more if they upsell you to the abortion.
Right.
And so and people like you who have adopted out of crisis pregnancy situations, those are the people who really cares, not the people who get
Right.
extra money if they can convince you to kill your child. And it reminds me of one thing Steven Crowder says, which is, I'm pro-choice. I'm pro four choices: abstinence, contraception, motherhood, and adoption. I'm simply not
Right.
pro the fifth choice, which is the active taking of an innocent human life.
Sure. Right. Right. Sometimes when somebody says, "Do you think a woman has a right to choose?" When you think about it, that's not a complete sentence. And so what I say, so well, do you think a woman has a right to take? And you know what they say? They say, take what? And I say,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
We only have a right to take depending on the thing we want to take. We only have a right to choose depending on the thing we want to choose. So, what is the choice in question here? Well, abortion. What is an abortion? Abortion is where you terminate the life of another human being. Period. That's it. That's the most
Yeah.
merely descriptive way that you could ever put it. Oh, another human being within a womb of that human being's mother, because there's not a single word in there that is factually controversial. But see, even when you put it that way, merely descriptively, well, then does a woman have the right to choose to kill the unborn human being in her womb? Okay, now that's a little stickier sounding. Of course, a lot of people say yes, because they still don't understand what that really means. And this
Right.
is where our persuasive enterprise comes into play.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. So book we got into, The Story of Reality, I highly, highly recommend it. The book we did not get into today, which perhaps we could have you back to talk about, Tactics. This has completely revolutionized my thinking. I remember reading it years ago. It was a goal to, I got to be able to think like this. And then recently going through it again, preparing for the interview, I was like, oh, I do that all the time now.
That's
So it's
great.
just,
I'm
it's
glad to
complete.
hear that. And incidentally, you're going to have to buy another copy because I'm right in the middle of rewriting for a second 10-year edition. And I've added a whole bunch more stuff that I think you'll really like. So, God willing, that'll be out at the end of this year.
Awesome, awesome. And do you have anything else people should be on the lookout for?
No, right now I'm consumed with that. I have my own
Okay.
podcast. I have my own podcast, and it's called Stand to Reason. You can find it on YouTube, iTunes, or you can go to str.org and you can subscribe to it there. We have two other shorter podcasts. That's 2 hours long. Two 1 hour segments that's delivered in 1 hour segments twice a week, once on Wednesday, once on Friday. And then there are two other smaller segments where people don't call in. That one they call in. The other smaller segments are not call-in segments. People send questions in, and Amy Hall, one of our bloggers, and I converse. She hosts the show and asks
Hmm.
me the questions. We interact on the questions. Those are about 20 minutes um, per show, and we have two of those a week too. So we have roughly 3 hours of podcast material every week. It's a great way for people to kind of get exposed to Stand to Reason and our very unique way of kind of engaging people and approaching problems. And that's less than 3 hours. So that's just one LA commute, is the way I put it. It's not burdensome to listen to that. And I think
Yeah.
that's one thing that they might want to think about doing is signing up for the podcasts.
Absolutely, guys. Definitely sign up for the podcast. Get the books. The website is str.org. Greg Koukl, thank you so much for being here, sir, and I hope to have you back soon.
Yes, I'd love to do it. Great talking with you, Stelman.